If you've been around the channel for a while, you know that I recently moved studios to a much smaller space, and this has made me get really intentional about what's in here because I can't fit all of my synths in here at one time. I've also gotten a bit bored with programming my synth parts all the time and drawing automations into Ableton, and so I've really enjoyed having just a rack of well thought about synthesizers, a combination that I know works well together, that I can just go and play. I think that's a really important aspect that can get lost a lot of times because we can do so much stuff in post in a DAW. But if you have just some basic keyboard skills, actually playing and performing parts on hardware or with a MIDI controller if you have soft synths, that can be a really transformative thing that will make your music feel more natural than going in and drawing stuff in later. So today I'm going to show you just a few of my personal favorite ways to play a synthesizer. Hopefully these things that I've done in the past and am rediscovering now will give you some inspiration to try some new things with your own music if you like synthesizers. And if you don't, I'm not sure why you're here. Synthesizers can do a lot of different things. There are a lot of variables, and that's what we like about them. Generally, I love programming a synth patch, but it does present some problems when we go to perform that synth patch. A piano is always a piano, a pipe organ is always a pipe organ. Those are the two instruments that I was trained on and have played for decades. And because of that, it's really the limitations of those instruments, the constants, if you will, that allow you to go incredibly deep and get to know the instrument incredibly well. And that's what we spend decades perfecting our technique on, those set limitations that the instrument has. We learn those constants incredibly well and learn to manipulate the few variables that we do have to make it more expressive. For example, the pipe organ, not velocity sensitive. Doesn't matter how hard you press a note, it's not going to get any louder. So the variables that we do have are stop selection. The sounds themselves we can change on an organ. And articulation, the way that we play each note. Do we play a passage legato? Do we put space between each note? We can actually fake an accent by putting a little space before the note that we want to feel like is accented. The piano has a fairly fast decay, but it is velocity sensitive, so we can use those two aspects to create the illusion of a connected melody, a connected line. Things that a singer or a violin player could do very naturally, we have to sort of fake at the piano through a technique called decay matching. Because the piano is a percussion instrument. Yeah, it's a percussion instrument, it's not a string instrument. You don't play the strings, you smack the strings with hammers. Because of that, it's very easy for a note to pop out of the texture, to pop out of the melody or the line, and sort of disrupt that line. With a synthesizer, a lot of those constants become variables, and we get to decide how the instrument is going to respond. So that's why I like to say we don't really play the synth. There is no technique for a synth. There's a technique for each patch, because each patch has its own set of constants and its own set of variables that either we or the sound designer who made the patch has predetermined. So here are some common patch playing techniques that I have used over the years and I'm rediscovering as ways to sort of provide inspiration for my new music that I'm currently working on. First off, how many voices does your synth have? How many notes can it play at a time? You can play a monosynth in a very different way than you can play a polysynth. It's much more forgiving in a lot of cases. That's why it's easier to shred, do synth solos on a monosynth, because there is no danger of sort of splatting a wrong note, because it's just going to steal the one voice and make it sound like the right note. You can never play two notes at a time. My track Grounded is a direct result of exploring this voice limitation. voice, so as I play two notes at a time, I'm trying to see what sort of interesting ways that voice can be stolen between the two notes that I'm playing or holding down at once. So the voice stealing limitation is not a bug, it's a feature in this track, part of the performance. Ow! Even polysynths typically, though you can play more than one note at a time, they still have a limited number of voices, especially an analog polysynth. The Muse back here, it's right there, only has 8 voices. The Prophet 12, which is in another room now, has 12. The Polyevolver only has 4 voices to play at once, and that's a limitation. And a limitation is an opportunity. Maybe I can get away with longer release times on a synth with just 4 or 6 voices, because the voice stealing is going to dictate that that release time can never build up to a point where it gets incredibly muddy. And the voices can steal from each other in kind of an interesting and pleasing way that we wouldn't necessarily expect. And from a harmony standpoint, which you know I love to talk about, just restricting yourself to 4 or 5 voices can really inspire you to do some interesting things and write in a linear style rather than always thinking about vertical blocked chords, which is something that I talk about more in my free composition ebook, which I've referenced many times. It's still down in the description below if you haven't grabbed that. When you have to think linearly like this, it can make the individual parts, because you're thinking about how one note in a chord moves to the next note in the next chord, much more carefully. It can make your parts a lot stronger. A paraphonic synth like the Pro 3 or the Matriarch, both of which I love very much and have used a ton, has a slightly different architecture which allows you to use different techniques. And I explained a lot more in detail about that in a video from a couple years ago. Now the Matriarch has 4 oscillators that can all be played simultaneously, but all of them are fed into the same mixer, the same filters, they're stereo filters here on the Matriarch, and the same filter and VCA envelopes. So you can think of the Matriarch's architecture and the way that this paraphonic synth is structured as being like a funnel, where all of the oscillators feed into the same signal path and they come out the end all sharing the same VCA, the same filters, the same everything. And that's in contrast to the Prophet 6, which would be all parallel. Lately, I've been really enjoying playing the Sub 37 in paraphonic mode, because it forces the 2 oscillators that it has, which you play at the same time, through the same filter and VCA, so it can lead to some really interesting distortion and ways that the filter interacts with those 2 oscillators being sort of squeezed through it. I also get to decide which oscillator gets the high part and which gets the low part. And if you swap around the octaves of the oscillators as you're playing, it can lead to some really interesting results. I also love using paraphonic synthesizers for ARPs because of the way that it can round robin through each oscillator, even though it's, once again, being squeezed through the same filter and VCA. And then changing the waveform of each oscillator or the octave mid-ARP can lead to even more interesting results. The travel after you press a key does absolutely nothing on a piano or a pipe organ. But on a synthesizer, it can do a whole lot of things, and it's one of my favorite means of expression when playing a synth. This is called aftertouch, and because I use both hands a lot when I'm playing a polysynth, it's one of my favorite ways to go about interjecting some modulation into a patch while I play. Usually I use a combination of aftertouch and an expression pedal rather than riding the mod wheel because, once again, both of my hands are usually tied up playing parts. Maybe the aftertouch adds some noise to control the filter, and the expression pedal can also control the overall cutoff of the filter. The possibilities there are fairly endless depending on what synthesizer you have and the modulation capabilities or mod matrix that it might have. And more polysynths today are featuring polyphonic aftertouch, like the Iridium back here. And that is wonderful. It can provide an even more expansive means of being expressive over your patches, because suddenly you have modulation control over each individual voice or each individual note, especially on sustained pads and things like that, which I absolutely love and made a whole video about, which, is pretty evident in my music that I like slow sustained things. MPE synths like the Osmos, which unfortunately I don't have to demonstrate for you, take this even further with even more means of expression. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful thing that companies are starting to explore more ways to interact with a traditional keyboard. One of my favorite means of inspiration or inspiring myself to play in a different way is interjecting some sort of rhythmic or clocked, synced modulation into a patch. And the purpose of this, once again, is not necessarily just set it and forget it or soundtrack by playing one note, but it's how I interact with it once that rhythmic element is going and I'm playing the patch live. Maybe I could have one clocked square wave LFO set to change the pitch of oscillator 1 by octaves. Maybe another LFO set to a different clock division could open and close the filter. Suddenly, I'm interacting with this patch in a very different rhythmic way, and the harmonies that I choose and when I change them are completely changed than they would have been without it. This is often the jumping off point for an entire track for me, can really inspire me to develop an idea. I love long sustained pad sounds, and one issue that we can have with them is too much buildup. Like I mentioned before, voice limitation can help with this, but sometimes we just need to learn a technique which comes directly from the pipe organ, finger legato or finger substitution. We can dial down the release time a little bit so that one chord doesn't blur into the next one too much and still have connected chord changes. Also, if you write linearly like I've talked about in my ebook, that helps with this. This also avoids having to use a sustain pedal so much because that can also lead to muddiness. Rather than just picking up your fifth finger and moving it to the next note, what if we substituted our fifth finger for our fourth finger so we could hold that note down and then have our fifth finger available to play the next note without breaking the phrase, breaking the line? This is how organists think. The organ is a more horizontal way of playing than even the piano. There's no sustain pedal to help us, and as soon as we release a note, it stops. So to play legato, we have to use finger substitution. And one thing that my first organ teacher taught me was the more intentional and rhythmic we can make our finger substitution, the more musical it feels and the more it feels like just part of the performance. So I like to do finger substitutions in time, in rhythm, like a subdivision. Like if I'm playing quarter notes, I would do my finger substitution on the eighth notes. Everything so far has been about playing a synth live without the aid of a sequencer or an arpeggiator. That does not mean that I am anti-sequencer or anti-arpeggiator, much to the contrary. If you are at all familiar with my music, you know that I use them all the time. But to me, the most interesting thing about sequences and arps are what they inspire me to do around them. How do I choose parts that fit within or around the sequence in an interesting way? One of my favorite things about the Muse is the way that the sequencer and the arp interact with one another. So I can actually play live an arpeggiated part in a different time division than the sequencer, which is running in the background. And because I have 8 voices, there's plenty of voices to do everything at once. I've done the same thing with the Sub 37, which interacts in a very different way when it's in paraphonic or duophonic mode by feeding it a MIDI sequence while I'm playing those 2 parts together. And that basically feels like the sequence and me performing are fighting against each other in interesting ways because it's constantly trying to steal voices between one or the other. And that has been really inspiring and has led me recently to create some things that I would never have come up with without that. So once again, the limitation of only being able to play 1 or 2 notes at a time with the Sub 37 becomes a feature. So I've just thrown a whole lot of ideas at you, but if I could boil it down to just 3 sentences, I would say, we don't play the synth, we play the patch. And the busier your patch, the more spacious your playing needs to be to accommodate for it. And thirdly, and most importantly, just use your ears. If you're playing something that doesn't fit with the patch, adjust your playing to accommodate the patch, or vice versa. But in my experience, once those 2 variables lock in and your performance lines up well with what the patch is programmed to do, that's where the real magic can happen, and that's what often inspires me to create entire tracks, entire pieces of music. So if you think about synths as being limitless possibilities of endless potential of sounds, that can be too overwhelming. But if I think about what are the limitations that can be most inspiring to me, that's when I actually get work done. If you want to see that video about pads that I've referenced in this video, I will have that for you right here.